Thank you very much, Theo. So very excited this evening to be introducing our four speakers. We got a bit of contrast from the first session, various reasons. First session was sort of 21st, 20th century. Now we're going right back to before the Common Era for most of the papers, or at least some of them are rooted there. And we're looking at early ascetic traditions, really, a couple of papers focused on Jainism. And also we've got four speakers rather than two. So we're going to be quite pushed for time. So I should probably stop waffling already and launch straight in. We're not going to break between papers for questions. So put your questions on the slide here. We'll do all that at the end, just so we can make sure we get all the papers done in good time. So I'm going to straight away hand over to Ruth McNeil, who completed a MA at SOAS last year, I believe, who's going to be talking to us. The title of her paper is Upright, the Soteriology of Straightness. So over to you, please, Ruth.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks everyone at the centre. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see that okay? Fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm presenting some of the research from my MA dissertation entitled Upright, the Soteriology of Straightness. Why is it that in contemporary literature, the ideal meditative posture for Buddhist, yogic, and Jaina practice is almost always described as being straight in the spine and/or body? Yet there is nothing inherently upright or stable in our skeletons. The term spinal column is an obvious misnomer. The spine is composed of curves and waves formed relative to the exertion of gravity on our bodies, continually expanding and contracting, influenced by respiration. This is a thing I was dreading was going to happen. My slides don't move. I'm not sure
try space or the cursor keys. It often happens to me as well. No.
Oh, I don't know why this is.
I don't know what else to recommend.
Let me just see if I can come out of it and see why. Sorry, everyone.
What if you quit actually showing the slideshow and start again? Maybe that.
My whole screen seems to have frozen.
Oh.
Oh. Okay, here we go.
Ah, brilliant.
Hey.
Maybe things will work. Okay. So I propose that the significance of physical uprightness within the meditative practices of the early Indian ascetic traditions has been overlooked. By focusing our attention on the upright stature of the human body, consistently deemed exterior and of little value, it is possible to uncover the importance of the body as an active medium, a locus of religious and philosophical ideas. By critically examining the role of posture in relation to the soteriological aims of meditative practice within early Indian asceticism, I investigate whether making the body straight is a fundamental characteristic of meditative posture for the Buddhist, Brahmins, and Jainas. If it is, my aim is to understand the significance of making the body straight in the context of meditative practice. Great. So the Shravana movements, namely the Buddhists and Jainas, arose in Northeast India circa 600 to 500 BCE. It is evident from an evaluation of textual sources that as the Shravana movements influence Brahminical culture over time, and as Brahminical ideas are both represented and rejected by the Shravanas, a pluralistic development of beliefs and practice occurred within this religious ferment. The early Buddhist and Jaina traditions shared two key innovations: developments in the concept of karma and advances in practices which facilitate an escape from the cycle of rebirth. Liberation from this cycle is therefore the soteriological aims of the Buddhists and Jainas. Only later does this become an aim of the Brahmins. However, the Buddhist concept of no self, anatman, pose a radical opposition to the Brahminical and Jaina notion of the soul, the Atman or Jiva, whereby liberation was achieved by recognizing the formless nature of the soul as the unbound inner self, which is entirely separate from the psychophysical person within whom it is embodied. Embodiment can then be understood as the source of bondage of the soul. For the Brahmins and the Jainas, ascetic practice was a highly regulated means by which to bring the body-mind complex to a halt in order to attain liberation. The practice of motionless austerities maintained the dual purpose of burning away karma and preventing new karma from arising, thus bringing about liberation from rebirth. Yet motionlessness would not eradicate desire, which the Buddhists considered the cause of suffering. Moreover, austerities, namely meditation without breath and starvation, were implemented, criticized, and subsequently rejected by the Buddha, who found that they did not lead him to the attainment of liberation. So the meditative postures of Palayanka and Padmasana, which are the first two, and you can see how similar they are, and Kayatsaga, the one on the end, which is the standing Jaina posture, were investigated in my dissertation by the means of two case studies to identify whether a somatic experience of soteriological aims is tenable through practice, and whether straightness of the body maintains a significant role in the meditative posture for the Buddhists, Brahmins, and Jainas. I don't know why this happens. I'm so sorry, everyone. It's been working absolutely fine all day. I might just keep going and hopefully it will catch up with me in a minute. So the next slide would be a list of sources, which isn't nearly as attractive and appealing looking as this slide. So maybe this is a good one to stay on. So the sources used in the study were firstly evaluated to explore whether soteriological aims can be enmeshed within posture. And secondly, to investigate whether making the body straight in meditative practice is an expression of those aims, or conversely, is antithetical to them. Because of time limitations tonight, I can only present the first case study and only in part, and I can only draw on a few of these sources. Okay, I continue without slides, apologies. So this case study that I'm going to present is exploring the development of Palayanka posture, so the first posture here on the left-hand side, within early Indic meditative practice through textual analysis drawing on the Buddhist and yogic corpus. The examples I use are from the Pali Nikāyas, the Mahābhārata Shastra, the Shravaka Bhumi of the Yogichara Bhumi Shastra, and the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, contextualized by the Bhagavad Gita and the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. Palayanka is not defined in the Pali Canon, but it appears on numerous occasions within the stock phrase, which describes the way in which a Buddhist monk should sit for meditation. Palayanka in Pali, or Paryanka in Sanskrit, is translated by Rhys Davids as a couch, sofa, or sitting cross-legged. The Samanaphala Sutta outlines the monastic path of one who has gone forth and abandoned the life of the householder. Before assuming Palayanka posture for formal meditative practice, the importance of virtuous behavior is emphasized. It is crucial for the monk to be consummate in virtue, as he is an adherent to the moral precepts and restraints of the senses, which are both precursors to and the foundations of contemplative action. Once the monk is equipped with virtuous attitude, he can assume Palayanka posture and begin meditative practice. And this is a quote from the Digha Nikāya. Having returned from his arms round, he sits down cross-legged, holding his body erect, and concentrates on establishing mindfulness in front of him. The meditative scheme described here is repeated throughout the primary Nikāyas. Palayanka posture is assumed, the body is made straight, ujjayi kayam, and meditative practice commences. Just seeing if I'll get my slides to go. No. Onwards. So two later texts in the Mahayana tradition further indicate the relevance of straightness in the body in Buddhist meditative posture. These examples chart the development of the purpose of straightness in Palayanka posture from the early sources, where the primary conveyances are virtue and wholesome mental states, to the incorporation of therapeutic, performative, and soterial aspects. So the first example is from the Madhyamaka school of the Mahayana tradition. In Nagarjuna's Mahābhārata Shastra, circa 2nd century of the Common Era, the Buddha is said to have sat in the cross-legged posture, Paryanka Bandha, as this position is the least tiring and does not allow the mind to wander. Moreover, among the 4 bodily positions, Paryanka is the most calming, so I'm quoting now from the text. It is the posture of ecstasy, the usual posture for finding the path. When King Mara sees it, he is sad and frightened. Sitting in this way is customary for the monastic. He sits cross-legged under a tree in the forest. The crowds who see him feel joyful and know that this monastic will certainly attain the path. So not only is Mara disarmed by seeing the posture, but there is an additional positive and performative element. It is clear that the posture is known by the laity and recognized for having specific salvic quality. In addition, Paryanka has a soothing effect on a practitioner.
Try clicking on the slide, apparently. There's been a hint.
Oh.
Daniela. Hey.
Oh.
Well done, Daniela. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Jim. Okay, so where are we? We're here. No, we're here. So furthermore, by being held straight in the mind is focused, furthermore, by being held straight, the mind is focused, and therefore a corollary to straightness is the preeminent of all samadhi states. So this is what's on the slide. When one keeps the body straight, it is easy to control the mind. In those whose body is straight, the mind is not idle. With right mind, the ascetic fixes his attention. When the mind wanders, he seizes it and brings it back. In order to enter into samadhi, he keeps his mind free of any distraction. It is by fixing his attention thus that the Buddha entered into the samadhi, Raja Samadhi. The second example is from the Yogacarita Bhumi Shastra, compiled by Asanga, circa 4th to 5th century of the Common Era, a treatise on yoga aligned to the Mahayana Buddhist tradition. The Shravaka Bhumi, thought to be the oldest part of the Yogacarita Bhumi Shastra, outlines yogic practice and spiritual realization. Within the third section of the Shravaka Bhumi, 5 reasons to support the practice of Paryanka are given, and after observing these, the meditator is instructed to sit down in Paryanka and adopt a straight position. The question, what is straightness of the body, is posed and then answered as follows. It is the state of the body of being positioned clearly upright. Within the mind, this goes along with unwavering straightness that is free of hypocrisy. In this regard, as long as the yogi practices with a straight body, torpor and drowsiness never overcome his mind. As long as his mind remains free from hypocrisy, no outer distraction ever overcomes it, after the yogi has set up mindfulness in front of him. So moving to the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, compiled around the 3rd to 4th centuries of the Common Era, this offers a methodological approach to attaining liberation through a number of soteriological paths. The paths provided by the 8 ancillaries, or limbs of yoga, include posture, asana, as the 3rd limb. The Patanjali Yoga Shastra names 13 asana for meditation. However, as the text offers no further details about them, it is necessary to refer to Shankara's later commentary for explication. The description of Paryanka in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra is inconsistent with the examples discussed here earlier. Here, Paryanka asana is explained as a supine posture with arms stretched out to the knees. This description of Paryanka is verified in the medieval Jaina yoga treatise, the Yoga Shastra of Hemachandra, who describes Paryanka as a seated cross-legged posture, similar to the posture described in the Buddhist corpus. However, in this version, the crossed lower legs rest over the feet. Lotus posture, Padmasana, another of the 13 asana described in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, corresponds closely to the Buddhist Paryanka posture. Padmasana is described as a seated pose with crossed legs where the feet are rest on the opposite thighs. In his commentary, Shankara uses Padmasana as the basis for the physical alignment of all other asana. He states that the hips, trunk, and neck are arranged, while the gaze is fixed on the tip of the nose, a description that is redolent of the meditative posture described in the Bhagavad Gita. One is firm, unmoving, holding in balance the head, neck, and body, looking at the tip of one's own nose. So it's valuable to recognize here that bodily straightness is not referenced in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, nor to my knowledge in the commentaries. Therefore, the disjunctive terminology describing the body's upright posture between the Buddhist literature and that which is used in the Patanjali Yoga Shastra are not merely significant in the way meditative posture is practiced, it is possible that they represent a divergency of religious beliefs. Meditative posture, as described in the earlier Brahminical Shvetashvatara Upanishad, may help to illustrate this point. It is clear that the threefold model of bodily organization, the head, neck, and body, described in the Bhagavad Gita, and similarly the threefold schema of Shankara's commentary on the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, is represented. In this Upanishad, the human body is homologized with the fire altar of Vedic ritual. The body is combined with Om as a way to see God, with the body itself becoming the bottom slab of a fire drill construction. Underneath Om, which is located higher in the upper drill. It is through a specific assembly that meditation arises. The construction of the fire altar is analogous with the body of the meditator, which is seated in such a manner that the three parts rise upwards. Thus, in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, the meditator constructs himself by means of a tripartite posture, replacing the medium of the altar with his own body, a practice of incorporation rooted in Vedic ritual. Furthermore, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra is informed by dualist Samkhya metaphysics. The goal of the Samkhya system, and by extension of Patanjali Yoga, is to liberate the unmanifest principle of pure consciousness, Purusha, from the principle of materiality, Prakriti, to achieve a pure state of freedom or aloneness, Kaivalya. The cessation of mental activity is crucial to the attainment of the state of absorption, Samādhi. Kaivalya occurs when Purusha is identified as one's true nature. Thus, the cessation of activity and the accompanying physical correlate of motionless are paramount to the soteriological systems of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, rather than straightness of the body. So just a few concluding remarks and further questions. Within the early Buddhist traditions, making the body straight is foundational to meditative practice. Straightness of body develops from the canonical literature, where it is corollary to virtue and to wholesome mental states, to later incorporate therapeutic, performative, and soterial valences. Straightness is not described as a crucial element of the meditative posture within the early literature of the Brahmins and Jainas. Instead, motionlessness holds primary importance in the meditative posture for these traditions. Could straightness then be considered a means by which Buddhism carved out a niche for itself in the milieu of early Indian asceticism? Could straightness allow for the embodiment of an ideological opposition to the Brahmins and Jainas? However, the act of becoming straight in body brings to light an inconsistency. It is unclear how the action of becoming straight does not diminish the ability to contemplate the body in the body, an essential aspect of Buddhist meditative practice. Therefore, becoming straight cannot be seen as an entirely effective means by which to attain the soteriological goal of Buddhist meditation. Yet it is evident that straightness acts as an indicator of one's virtue experientially and performatively, providing the means by which Buddhist teachings and values may be embodied. Scholarship upholds a prevailing view that meditating bodies are straight, which, while not wholly inaccurate, is insufficiently broad. It may be the case that the outward appearance of posture is neither able to provide an understanding of the soteriological telos it embodies, nor be authentic to the nature of praxis. However, it is undeniable that the body is grounds for meditative practice, which offers a multiplicity of experiences, of which straightness is only one.
Great. Thank you very much, Ruth. It's very thought-provoking. Lots to think about and comment upon. But as I said, we're not going to have any discussion now. We're going to plough straight on, and we're going to go to Erica Morton Magill now, who is doing her MA at SOAS at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. He's going to be talking to us about microorganisms from a macro perspective, reverence for the smalls in Jain Yoga. So over to you, please, Erica.
Thank you.
Well, that was quick, straight in.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Theo, the Center of Yoga Studies and SOAS for this opportunity So as Jim said, my paper, Microorganisms from a Macro Perspective, Reverence for the Smalls in Jain Yoga, engages primary and secondary textual and visual material to zoom in on the smallest creatures in Jain cosmology. This micro view paradoxically allows for a macro perspective on liberatory possibilities for both the individual and the collective. In Jain cosmology, every living being possesses a soul worthy of autonomy. This includes embodied beings of the tiniest magnitude, like microorganisms and bacteria. Mahābhārata, the founder of Jainism and a contemporary of Gautama Buddha, realized this animate nature of the universe. The Acharanga Sutra, the oldest of Jain texts dating to the 1st centuries BCE, says of Mahābhārata, knowing the earth bodies and water bodies and fire bodies and wind bodies, the lichens, seeds, and sprouts, he comprehended that they are imbued with life. Like his Shramanic contemporaries, Mahābhārata taught that samsara is cyclical rebirth into an existence characterized by suffering, dukkha. In the Shramanic traditions, one's acquired karmas or actions determine one's rebirth and also allow for the possibility of liberation. The Jains have developed a unique soteriological path, moksha marga, that honors this view. The path is based on a metaphysically dualist ontology that separates the soul from the body, as well as a view of karmic law, karmavad, as an ethical, metaphysical, and cosmological principle that governs life. Karmavad deems each embodied soul qualitatively equal. The way that the soul interacts with matter, pudgala, determines its karmic burden and therefore lot in this life and the next. This is depicted in the image on the left, the swastika representing the cycle of rebirth and the unenlightened stage of bondage. The 3 dots represent the 3 jewels of moksha marga, and the curved line is the place to which a liberated soul whose karma has been completely extinguished will rise. So let's begin to zoom in. Jainism proposes a cosmological hierarchy of beings based on capacity for sensory perception and self-awareness. Ekindriyas, single-sensed beings, reside at the bottom of Jain's cosmological hierarchy of sensorial beings, and they possess only the ability to touch and be touched. Though they are so small as to be invisible to the human eye, they're nonetheless important players in the drama of life and liberation. Like all embodied beings, ekindriyas are animated by vital life force and are the product of soul, jiva, encountering matter. But they're so tiny and burdened by karma that theirs is the lowest of possible destinies, characterized by extremely gross sensory activity and pervasive ignorance. Some argue that they're not even capable of salvation. Nonetheless, these single-sensed beings possess residue of perception, knowledge, energy, and bliss. Ekindriyas are of several types. In Jain cosmology, elemental bodies of earth, water, fire, and wind exist not as fundamental building blocks of reality, but rather they're the product of soul and matter, just like human bodies, and are also capable of accumulating karma. Ekindriyas can also take the expression of plant bodies and can be single-souled or group-souled. The latter, called Nigoda, are so tiny and undifferentiated that they lack even individual bodies. Though small and clustered, Nigoda are so numerous and omnipresent that the world is described as close packed with Nigoda, like a box filled with powder. This Jaina biology aligns with modern microbiology, which affirms that microorganisms are small, they're extremely important, and there is an awful lot of them. Contemporary microbiologists indeed understand that humans are in symbiotic relationship with Nigoda, as in the case of the microbiome. What Jain biology and cosmology also reveal is that all living beings in a given region are closely interrelated with one another and with the environment. As biologist Merlin Sheldrake speaks of it, the world is comprised of entangled life forms and ontologies. This sense of connection to and interdependence with even the tiniest of embodied beings fuels the Jain's radical implementation of ethics. Because the harm done to life forms, no matter how minuscule, is the primary cause of karmic bondage, ahimsa, or non-harm, is implemented to free the soul that's trapped in a cycle of rebirth. But the submicroscopic Nigoda radically challenge the principle of ahimsa. It's impossible to avoid wholesale harm to living beings, as the world is filled with microscopic and submicroscopic organisms. The very act of being alive involves the destruction of such tiny life forms. Eating, digesting food, breathing, sitting, and moving about all involve the destruction of Nigodas on a massive scale. Jains thus engage in constant self-monitoring and behavior modification to avoid, as much as possible, the destruction or creation of life forms. Jains cultivate, in other words, a Nigoda consciousness, or what I'm calling in the tradition of microbiologist and microanimist Siv Watkins, reverence for the smalls. Knowing the earth is teeming with beings, Jain monastics will walk with bare feet, and many will carry brooms to clear the ground in front of and around them to ensure no beings are harmed in their walking. You can see this in the top left image. The Atharanga Sutra instructs monks to walk attentively, looking on the path. And knowing that the human body is comprised of countless Nigoda, a sage should not rub his eyes nor scratch his body. Digambara monks, sky-clad, in particular, are known for wandering naked so as to avoid catching any microbes or other tiny beings in the folds of their clothes. This is pictured in the bottom middle image. Shvetambara Jains, white-robed, ritualistically inspect their clothes for such souls. And so as to avoid inhaling Nigodas, Jain monks and nuns wear cloth masks called mupati, pictured in the top right image. This prevents small organisms from being inhaled or ingested, and it also encourages speech that is non-harmful. Right conduct is also pursued through meditation and yoga, practices that further encourage this attention to detail and interconnectedness. Jainism's fourfold meditation, accepted from canonical times to the present, is called Shukla Dhyana, pure meditation, and is defined in the 12th century Yoga Shastra by Hemachandra as the state of pure self-awareness or knowership. The first stage is a focus-based meditation. This focusing capacity is arguably primed by the sensitized and scientific Jain approach to the material world. It also requires a keen investigation of an object from all points of view, encouraging a many-sided exploration of an object, or Anekantavada, a theory of the multiplexity of reality. It addresses the question of how, in a complex world, one can hold any claims to truth. Indeed, no phenomenon can be comprehended and analyzed without its individual ontological context. Because no one view encompasses the total view, life must be approached from a multifaceted perspective. Anekantavada developed as a hermeneutic tool to interpret scripture, but today it is an expression of the Jain viewpoint that every individual being is intricate in nature and interconnected with other entities through infinite relations. So what of liberation? Over the past year, a subvisible virus, what the Jains might call an ekindriya, defied national borders and skin boundaries, infecting hosts worldwide of every nationality and creed. SARS-CoV-2 points to the Jain Anekantavada viewpoint that we are interconnected and interdependent. A virus that hopped from an animal to a human affects beings all over the planet. When one of us is unwell, we are all unwell. Jains pay attention to this intricacy, noticing and protecting microscopic beings as a soteriological pathway to liberation. This microanimism informs their every interaction and is a way of engaging with life. It expresses the idea that we are all inescapably participants in a world that communicates our shared existential trajectory. Karma is a metaphysical accounting of one's engagement with dynamic reality. The soul's karmic debt must be paid in full in order to attain liberation. One's karmic balance sheet, then, is only as good as one's relationship to and with the surrounding environment. It is a system of relationships that sustains beings in this life and the next. Scholar Andrea Jain warns against the green gaze of environmentalist scholarship, arguing that Jain ontology cannot help us with our social tasks. But as Jain philosophers teach, when perception shifts, so too does behavior. When one is fully attuned to life's complex stratifications, when one is deeply cognizant of the suffering nature of the simplest of beings, most especially, it's at this point that an ontological crossing over is possible and release may be obtained. The impetus for the Jain path is therefore not ideological alone, but relational, arising from the fundamental experience of being sentiently with others. Seeing the world as animate, the Jain view of Ekindriyas highlights their vision of a purposeful and hierarchical cosmos. It also dictates ethical engagement with the worldwide ecosystem. Might this reverence for the smalls outline a path for salvation societally? I think it bears further research to explore in what specific ways a Nigoda consciousness honed through right conduct, including meditative and yogic practices, may in fact lead toward both ethical engagement with and solutions for climate collapse, epidemiological disaster, and human extinction, all social catastrophes driven by inattention to our interconnectedness. What if we paid attention to the smallest of beings and treated them as sovereign, capable of suffering, with hope for an alleviation of that suffering, and perhaps even salvation? Might this animate worldview lead us to tread more carefully? Might seeing the world as animate and worthy of reverence reveal how closely we are living to the consequences of our actions? From the Jain viewpoint, lighting a match births countless fire bodies. And when the match dies out, so too do the fire bodies. Not wanting to assume responsibility for those bodies' lives nor their karma, stringent Jain monks and nuns avoid even this simple task. If we had even an inkling of that mindset, would we set off fireworks that ignite whole forests in, say, the name of gender reveal parties, which here on the West Coast of the United States have been responsible for thousands of acres of burns? The blue or pink smoke not only revealing the gender of a newborn, but also killing infinite beings, human, animal, elemental, vegetal. If we developed a microbit of Jain microanimism into our lives, what social changes might be possible? The Jain prescription for liberation is both metaphysical and practical. Underlying it is a simple mandate, though perhaps not easy to abide. All breathing, existing, sentient creatures should not be slain, nor treated with violence, nor abused, nor tormented, nor driven away. It seems likely that following this mandate carries potential to alleviate suffering, not just for the individual, as Mahābhārata and his contemporaries like Gautama Buddha sought to do, but also for the collective. Thank you. I welcome your insights. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, feedback, or thoughts.
Thank you very much, Erica. Again, very thought-provoking, nicely sort of bringing this very ancient teaching very much up to date. Wondering what Jains make of the COVID virus, whether that's a Nigoda or not, and what should be done with it. Anyway, we're just about on time. Hopefully we'll have a bit of time for some questions, so I'm going to have to plough straight on though, I think. So if we can go to Scott Lamps, please, who's also completed his dissertation, his MA at SOAS, Yoga Studies, and is going to be talking to us about early Samādhi, evolution and meaning in the Nikāyas, Upaniṣads and Mahābhārata. So over to you, please, Scott.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And thanks to the Center of Yoga Studies. And also, wow, thank you, Ruth and Erica, you guys, what lovely research and inspiring. My name is Scott Lamps, and I just completed a master's degree here at SOAS. What I would like to talk to you today about is what I call early Samādhi, specifically focusing on the meaning of samadhi in the early texts of both Brahmanism and Buddhism. What I've found is that Brahmanic and Buddhist samadhis, at least in these early texts, are actually quite different. They do have some similarities, but they come from beliefs, they come from practices, and they represent outcomes that are actually quite distinct from one another. Just to begin all on the same page, let me briefly define samadhi. Speaking very generally, samadhi is a high or even a supreme state. It can be a state of mind, or it can be a state of being. It's usually related to meditation, devotion, or union with the divine. In Brahmanism and yoga, it is very commonly translated as absorption, contemplation, or ecstasy, and it often comes atop yogic anga systems. And in Buddhism, it is almost universally translated, at least nowadays, as concentration. So let's look at what I mean by early samadhi. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the concept of samadhi changed, and then it solidified and reified in this new form. The most common understandings of samadhi come from texts at the tail end of this period of systematization. Influential texts like the Abhidhamma Buddhist Visuddhimagga and the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali. My research has thus far has focused on the period before this shift, what I call early samadhi. This period includes the Buddhist Pali Nikāyas, the Vedic Upaniṣads, and the Mahābhārata, including the Bhagavad Gita. All of these texts include early forms of samadhi. An important distinguishing factor between early and later samadhis is the use of language. Generally speaking, the later texts heavily favor the noun samadhi, while the earlier texts are at least as likely to use its adjectival form, samahita, which means collected. And a perfect example of this is the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, where the sutras themselves use the word samadhi 12 times, and every single use is the noun samadhi. There's not a single use of the adjective samahita. And if we contrast that with the early Brahmanic texts, where the noun samadhi actually rarely appears, but the adjective samahita does occur with some frequency, giving us a kind of proto-samadhi. In the Bhagavad Gita, samahita is used to describe Atman, which is the eternal being within each individual. The Atman is non-dual, and samahita describes this non-duality. In the 6th chapter, the Bhagavad Gita says, "The highest self of the victorious one, the peaceful one, is composed, samahita, in cold and heat, pleasure and pain, so also in pride and disgrace." So it's important to recognize here that samahita is describing the non-duality of Atman itself. Even as our outer form experiences these dualities, the highest self is composed. The non-duality of Atman is also emphasized in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which immediately follows to say that when a person knows the nature of Atman, she then reflects those very same qualities. Among these reflected qualities is being collected, samahita. This is from the 4th chapter of the Brihadaranyaka. I'll just read the 2nd paragraph here. A man who knows this, therefore, becomes calm, composed, cool, patient, and collected, samahito. Now, This passage does not suggest that one should act calm in order to see Atman, and it does not suggest that by acting calm, one can approximate the state of Atman. Rather, knowledge of Atman is the cause, and the collected state that arises is the result of that knowledge. So this is the first coherent explanation of Brahmanic proto-samadhi, that it is a reflexive outward state of non-duality and collectedness, and it necessarily comes as the result of knowing Atman. Now, there is another different explanation of Brahmanic proto-samadhi that is the flip side of this. Here, one cultivates an even non-dual state first, and the result is that knowledge of Atman becomes possible. The Shanti Parvan of the Mahābhārata says, the extremely energetic Atman is located in the hearts of all beings. However, because of being enveloped with tamas and rajas, it cannot be seen in the bodies. So the method to know or see the Atman is then to reduce these gunas, to reduce the duality and multiplicity of the more external parts of the self. Only then do we have a chance of seeing Atman. This same idea appears in the Katha Upanishad, and here we learn that a man must first be composed, samahita, if he hopes to grasp Atman. I'll just read the second paragraph here. It says, not a man who has not quit his evil ways, not a man who is not calm or composed, a samahita, nor even a man who is without a tranquil mind could ever secure it by his mere wit. So here it is stated explicitly that one must be calm and collected first, and then knowledge of Atman can follow. So you can see the two different explanations of this collected state, this proto-samadhi. One describes Atman itself and arises in a person reflexively when they know Atman, and the other is cultivated in order to know Atman in the first place. So it seems that the Brahmanic idea of samadhi was quite fluid in this period, but both uses are directly linked to knowledge of the Atman in one way or another. And this makes it uniquely Brahmanic and very different from the Buddhist samadhi. So let's look at what samadhi means in the canonical texts of Buddhism, specifically in the Pali Nikāyas. First of all, early Buddhist samadhi is a state of mind. Okay. Specifically, it is a unification of mind. And we actually get pretty close to an outright definition of samadhi in the Chula-Vidala Sutta, which says, unification of mind, friend Visakha, is samadhi. Of course, we then need to decipher what on earth unification of mind actually means. Later commentators often take this to mean something like concentration or focus. But as we look a bit deeper into the way that samadhi is attained and used, it becomes clear that early Buddhist samadhi is actually a mental state free from thought. Okay. What is important about this is concentration and focus require thought. And if samadhi is a thought-free state, rendering it as concentration misrepresents it profoundly. Okay. I arrive at this understanding from two different angles, which independently lead to the very same conclusion. The first is the 4 satipatthanas, or the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The 4 foundations of mindfulness are the basis of samadhi. So it says in the Chula-Vidala Sutta. This again takes us on a brief but necessary detour, and it requires us to examine the four Satipatthanas, specifically looking at what they encourage and what their outcome might be. Okay. The Danta Bhumi Sutta offers some clarity about the purpose of the four Satipatthanas. I'm going to put up a big quote, so don't be frightened by it. Okay. And I'll read the first half of this to you. But pay attention to the repetition here, because it gives us an idea of what the true lesson is. Okay. Come, monk, abide contemplating the body as the body, but do not think thoughts connected with the body. Abide contemplating feelings as feelings, but do not think thoughts connected with the feelings, etc., etc. So the purpose here seems to be to not think thoughts, regardless of where the mind may be. So when we achieve the goal of the Satipatthanas, we attain a mental state which is free from thought. And this is Samādhi. And this goes a long way to explaining how Samādhi is a unification of mind, because in ordinary circumstances, the mind is pulled in many directions by various trains of thought. And through the practice of the Satipatthanas, the monk stops those trains of thought, thus arriving at a non-multiple, a non-scattered state of mind, a unification of mind. And this understanding of Samādhi is supported by another fundamental aspect of early Buddhism, which is the four jhanas, or meditative states. The second jhana specifically is born from Samādhi, and it is described vividly as avitaka avichara, which means without thought, without reflection. So we have two explanations of Samādhi that point to the complete absence of thought. And in my mind, this makes it highly questionable that Samādhi should be translated or understood as concentration, at least in these early texts. Admittedly, when this transitional period happens and the Abhidhamma comes along, specifically, the meaning of Buddhist Samādhi changes profoundly. To summarize, Brahmanic proto-Samādhi is a non-dual state of being connected with Atman. Sometimes it describes Atman itself, which upon knowledge of Atman is then outwardly reflected in a person. Other times it is an active cultivation of calmness and non-duality, which can enable a person to see Atman in the first place. Early Buddhist Samādhi is a state of mind defined as unification of mind. It is a thought-free state. Now, this understanding of the early Samādhis may impact our view of later Samādhis and allow us to trace the evolution of the concept with some greater clarity. For example, the texts of Abhidhamma and Mahayana Buddhism seem to be influenced as much by the Brahmanic ideas as by the early Buddhist concept of Samādhi. Alternately, texts like the Yoga Sutra and the later parts of the Maitri Upanishad show a lot of Buddhist influence in their conception of the mind and its cultivation. Ideally, then, this research will continue through this transitional period, through the classical period, into tantric conceptions of Samādhi, into Hatha Yoga and Tibetan Buddhism, and all the way up to the modern age, creating a sort of Samādhi family tree. That is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Scott. That was great. And I've been getting some back channel comments about how beautifully presented it was, and all the other presentations have been so far. Yeah, thanks. We're just about on time to hopefully have 10 minutes or so for questions. So I'm just going to plow straight onto the next one. We've got Corinna Lhoir, who is a PhD candidate at Hamburg, did MA at SOAS, and she's going to be talking to us about concepts of self in Jain Yoga with reference to the Yogapradīpa, a medieval Jain text on yoga. So over to you, please, Corinna.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you, Jim, for introducing me, and also thank you, the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies, for giving me the opportunity to share my research, or at least a small part of this research, which I broke down a little bit in order to make it more understandable. So hopefully, okay, can you all see my presentation okay? Can you hear me okay? Thank you, because I'm not at home. I feel a little bit uncomfortable, but let's give it a try. So what can you expect from today's presentation? I'm interested in the self and the different terms or concepts of self within the Indian traditions, and then what I want to do is give you a short introduction to how the self has been depicted, described, or named in three Jain texts. The first one is a classic Jain text, the Tattva Sutra, which you have already heard some parts of in some of our earlier presentations today, and then in two texts related to Jain Yoga, one by Haribhadra Suri from the 8th century of the Common Era, and a later text, Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra, from the 12th century of the Common Era. And this findings I'm going to relate to findings I have made in my text, the Yogapradīpa, which is a medieval Jain text on yoga, with one salient theme, the Supreme Self. The Yogapradīpa has been refound by Dr. Jason Birch while he did some research for the Hatha Yoga project, and he was so kind to give it to me for a further inspection, and I plan to do a translation of this text into English, and with some notes, and also do a critical edition in order to present this text to the world. I have always been fascinated by Jainism, and it's all started out while doing my MA at SOAS, when I first had a look at where I was able to compare the definition of yamas as they are found in the Patanjala Yoga Shastra to the definition of the 5 great vows of Jainism as they are presented in Tattva Sutra. And as you see, I'm going to shorten this a little bit, they are not only using almost identical terminology, but they also give this terminology in the same sequence. So I thought this cannot be, this could not be that's not a coincidence. That's somebody used apparently the same sources here. And we have already heard that Patanjali drew from Buddhist sources when composing his Patanjala Yoga Shastra, but we have not, unfortunately, been able to track down the Jain influence on Patanjali and Patanjala Yoga so far. Okay, and why Yogapradīpa? Take a look at Yogapradīpa, verse number 134. Where you find the so-called samyamas in this text, which are also using the same vocabulary, the same terminology, almost the same, except for the asangata in the end, where non-attachment has taken over the place of non-possessiveness by Patanjali, but it's again the same sequence. Okay, so we already we heard today about the main ideas that came from Buddhist and Jains, the Shramana movement, and then later entered Brahmanism as well, about samsara, the circle of rebirth, moksha, nirvana, the sociological goal of human existence, to get out of the circle of rebirth. We heard of karma that can be neutralized through non-activity, and we also also heard of the Atman, the self that can be realized by the practice of some sort of mental training, which we can call yoga during this further time period. So the self in Indian philosophical thought has been named differently. There have been many concepts. It has been called Atman, called Purusha, Brahman, or Jiva, and even the Buddhists who do not believe in Atman, they called it the Anatman or Anatta in Pali, the non-self. Although they also had the Tathagata Dhatu, which is the immanent Buddha nature, which is quite a close concept to the Atman of the others. The Atman self itself, the term itself already appears in Rig Veda, where it usually denotes breath. And it is said to be coming from the root an, which means to breathe. The Rig Veda also uses jiva, but in the sense of life. In the Upaniṣads, a little bit later, the idea of Atman is already a little bit more evolved to a certain life force, a consciousness, an essence, a nature, or an ultimate reality, which whatever concept is described there, they all share some common points, which is that the Atman is immortal, it dwells within the body when it is alive, and it is also responsible for the body being alive. And of course, as we already heard, the knowledge or the realization of Atman leads to liberation. Okay, when we come to the self or soul in classical Jainism, and with classical Jainism, I mean that the way the soul or self has been described in the Tattva Sutra, we will see that Jains use in that connotation and in this text the term jiva. I have chosen Tattva Sutra as my point of the beginning of as my comparison, because the Tattva Sutra has been accepted by both Jain strands or both Jain sects, the Digambara Jains as well as the Shvetambaras. And it is not a canonical text, but it might be called the Bible of Jainism, and it has, I think, a worth equal to the Bhagavad Gita for Hindus. And there we find in chapter 2, verse 1, a definition of the self or soul, as it is translated by Tatya, as something that it is defined by setting it into relation of other elements and telling you what it is not. And then it starts to distinguish 5 different states of the soul that a soul or self can have. And 4 of those states are all related to karma, the influence, suppression, or elimination of karma. And while all the soul is in contact, whatever kind of contact with karma, it changes its state. And only the final state, the 5th state, is the one that is innate, the innate nature of the soul, which is, you can see the Sanskrit term in the verse number 7 of the 2nd chapter, which reads that being a soul, being worthy of liberation or being unworthy of liberation and so on, constitute the innate nature of the soul, which basically means that once the soul has been freed from all kinds of karma, it then can rest in its innate state, which is pure bliss and pure conscience. So just as the short idea how the self had been originally defined in the Tattva Sutra. So a little bit later, we do have, I'm going to have just briefly have a look at two texts. Hari Bhagavasuri, he wrote the beneath other texts, the Yoga Drishti Samuchaya, his compendium of yoga views. And later on, we'll turn to Hemachandra in his Yoga Shastra, the treatise on yoga. The Yoga Drishti Samuchaya is a comparison or comparative analysis of 4 yoga schools. One is the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, one is a Buddhist a yoga system, there is a Hindu yoga system in it, and Haribhadra's own yoga system. And he has a look at the self in this treatise, where he describes the self as follows. We have here, I will just give the translation to keep it short. The eternal Shiva, the highest Brahman, the accomplished soul, suchness. With these words, one refers to it, though the meaning is one in all the various forms. We have already heard a little bit of Anikantavada in one of our presentations today. Anikantavada is also a little bit in this verse where he Haribhadra shows that he pays respect to other religions or other philosophical strands, such as Shiva, or here we see Brahman. He accepts them. But still, of course, is of the opinion that the Jain view is still superior to it. Pay attention to the word Atman here. We have Sit Atma here, the accomplished soul. Soul is denoted as Atman in this text, but Haribhadra also uses in other verses the word Jiva, the term Jiva. And there is a slight distinction that I could identify. Atman is a little bit more used when it comes to general terms of the meaning. And Jiva is used a little bit more when it comes to individual souls. So there's a slight differentiation with the two terms. So the Yoga Shastra, Hemachandra's Yoga Shastra treatise of handbook on Jainism also focuses a lot on meditation and also on how to free the self from also deluding karma. And in chapter 4, which is the most important chapter, he gives the following example for definition of the self. Here we see the self has the nature of consciousness, but due to the impact of karma, it is embodied. The emancipated self, however, is spotless, and its karma being burned in the fire of pure meditation, which means Shukla Dhyana. And then we have the typical Jain view on the self. The self is embodied due to karma, but the emancipated, the liberated, the pure self is spotless once the karma has been burned. And also we see again twice Atma here, Atmaiva and Siddha Atman. Also in Hemachandra's work, we have the use of Atman as well as Jiva. So he uses both terms and he uses them interchangeably. So we are about 600 years after the first work I talked about, and there has been this slight change of meanings has already taken place. So Jiva and Atman used interchangeably. Let's come now to the Yogapradīpa. That's the text I'm working with. I would have loved to talk a little bit more in more detail about the single manuscripts, but time would not allow to do so. I was able to locate 2 more monist manuscripts when I went to India and did some research there, which was quite exciting. And so, one of them, was very, very old and suggested that the Yogapradīpa was older than we had originally thought. So it does not only predate the 18th century, but it might even be as old as the 16th century, which the older manuscript implies. Okay, the salient theme of the Yogapradīpa is to see the self within the body by means of meditation. And it contains several Jain elements, such as Shukla Dhyana, the pure meditation, 3 jewels, the way the Jain path to liberation. Ashta karma, an eightfold nature of karma, and he also mentions Parshvanatha, the 23rd Tirthankara, one of those Jain leaders, and that was the one prior to Mahābhārata, the one that we consider the founder of Jainism. Let's have a look at how the Supreme Self is described in the Yogapradīpa. The Atman only is free from all constituents and pure. It has the form of wisdom, knowledge, and it is free from karma, free of karma. It is to be meditated upon by those longing for liberation. So that's one example. You see the word term Atman is used uniquely, by the way. And here's the second verse where it reads, by repeated practice in this way, yogins, it's related to another verse where the way of practice had been described in more detail. So by repeated practice in that way that had been described before, the yogins observe through this meditation their own self located within the body in accordance with its state. And there we also have the mentioning of the state, this one of those states that the self is in, according to Tathvata Sutra. So there is no mentioning of jiva anymore in the Yogapradīpa. The Yogapradīpa uses the term Atman uniquely, without variations. And yeah, we have one more. Don't have any more time, but okay, we also have a kind of a verse that reminded me of Mahābhārata, be it Shankara, Shiva, or Ganesha, whoever is always dear to a person. There is only one Lord seen, as in peace and resting in nirvana, which is inside the body, the self that is inside the body. Well, whoever you want to call it, however you want to call it, and whatever belief you have, it still is the one and only Atman, which is always the same. Okay, so let's come to my conclusion so far, which is just one part of my research so far. The Yogapradīpa is a Jain text in the true sense of the meaning, because it is consistent with the Jain teachings in vocabulary and in main proposition. It uses Atman instead of Jiva. We have seen it has been, Jiva has been totally replaced in total, but this is coherent with the earlier text of Jain scholars like Hemachandra and Mahābhārata, and I'm of the opinion that you can see how the terminology, the Jain terminology, has been adapted to the use of Atman, probably in other religions or in other philosophical strands. So thank you for your kind attention, and I hope you could catch everything I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Corinna. That's great. Good to see how the Jain sort of adoption of yoga and I mean I'm well aware of Hemachandra's text, but seeing how it goes beyond that and yet still manages to keep that sort of Jain flavor. Now we haven't got much time. I mean, I don't have to run off. I don't know if people have to run off, but we've got quite a few questions on the Slido, and I am also going to use my chair's privilege to, I'm just going to have one question. I could ask questions of everyone, but I've got one for Scott, in fact. So I was wondering, I mean, I think it's a really, really fascinating area of research, this early instances or early understandings of samadhi. And I was wondering, because if I understood correctly from the passages you were looking at, in the Buddhist texts, we see lots of mentions of samadhi using that word, whereas the Brahmanical ones were more samahita. So I was just wondering, does that reflect it's not something I've looked into at all, but does that suggest to me that perhaps in the Buddhist traditions, it was a much more, it'd been more conceptualized? Because often it seemed that with the samahita references, it could just be a sort of non-spiritual, non-soteriological adjective, just as you translated it, collected, whereas samadhi in the Buddhist text seemed to be a rather more sort of thought through concept. Is that a...
Yeah, I think that's an accurate way to represent it. I think the Buddhists were clear about a concept that they called samadhi, And they developed it for, I mean, almost 1,000 years before it really crosses over into something like the Patanjala Yoga Shastra, where it becomes really solidified as a non-Buddhist concept. But it develops in Buddhism for, like, in the canonical texts, in the Abhidhamma, in the Mahayana, there's like hundreds and thousands of different samadhis. And during all that period, to the best of my knowledge, there is not really any meaningful or coherent use of samadhi in Brahmanical texts.
Okay, so this would be another sort of feature of Patanjali in which he's taking Buddhist terminology or Buddhist concepts and sort of reworking them. Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Right, we've got plenty of questions. I'm going to, the first one, the top of the pops that's been upvoted the most is from Richa. So if we can go to Richa, or if that's not, I know she's in India, it's going to be very late, but she's still with us and prepared to ask her question directly. She's not appearing. Are you there, Richa? Otherwise, I will ask it for her. She can watch the video. I know she's had a long day at the the Yoga Studies summer school. Oh, she's there. Hi.
Yeah, but if you could please ask the question, because I lost the page.
Okay, I will. So the question is, we see mentions of yogis like Ashtavakra, who had a curved back. So this is going to be for Ruth, who had curved back, twisted body, etc. The term, the name means 8 bends in the body. Are there any other mentions in these texts where straightness isn't a moksha mandate? That's for you, Ruth.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the question. I didn't find any in the Brahmanical yoga ones, but I was really in a very condensed time period, and I think as if I went further into Tantra, or further forwards into Tantra, I think there would be more of those things. I mean, I kind of looked at it very to sort of get a context, but I didn't do any further work there. So I didn't find them in the Upaniṣads, but it wasn't a completely over comprehensive view, but I did try and find other kinds of bodies and other kinds of postures. But the thing that came through a lot was the idea of sama or saman, which can be translated as straight, but often more as even. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. A bit vague, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ruth. Yeah, I'm afraid, well, not afraid, lucky you, lots of questions coming your way. They're all the top ones are heading through. So I think next is an anonymous one, so I'll read it out. How is straightness connected to breath in MPY, so modern postural yoga? The discourse is straight back and open chest, allow the breath to flow freely. Any pre-modern evidence of this?
That's a great question. In the same Upanishad, the one I looked at, it goes on to mention that the breath will then flow more freely or something like that directly after the quote from the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. So, but there isn't much in what I've looked at in terms of connecting posture to breath. And again, I think that as time progresses, there will be much more of that moving into Tantra and Kundalini. Those things seem to take root, but they weren't evident in the text that I looked at specifically.
Okay, then we've got another one from Richard, but this for Erica. So I'll read this one out. Jainism and Buddhism were parallel Shramana traditions. In Buddhism, wrath is used as a tool for moksha, while Jains totally prohibit it. Your thoughts on this?
That's an interesting question. I think it can be convincingly argued in some instances that the Shramanic traditions were competing for resources as well as followers. And so in some instances, their differing viewpoints were a result of that. As far as I know, Buddhism doesn't have quite the same categorization of beings. It doesn't have the same scientific viewpoint of beings that Jainism developed, where it's really, very clear about the number of senses that each being has and how that dictates and changes the way that they move through the world. So yeah, very, very different viewpoints on that, on wrath and himsa or ahimsa and categorization of beings.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to try and share them around. Is there Corinna hasn't had a question yet, actually. So Corinna, there is one here for you again from Richa, who's very prolific in asking questions. Could you please elaborate on how brahmacharya is explained in Jain texts and in the Yogapradīpa? Is it just celibacy or is it something more than that? Thanks.
I cannot. Simple as that. I'm very sorry. I have not dealt with the peculiarities of brahmacharya and Jainism. Sorry.
Right. My guess is it's probably quite strict celibacy in the Jain texts because they're normally geared towards the ascetics. I guess so too. What I can say is that I just studied a medieval text that was dealing with women and liquids in connection with them, and that was quite strict and quite something that I decided not to dive too deep into. Fair enough.
Yeah, quite strict.
Okay, we've got a question from Hagar for Ruth. So if Hagar's there, if we can go to her, please. If you just say something, Hagar, you'll appear.
Yeah, I'm here. 1 second. I was wondering, you made the distinction between Brahminical traditions and Jain tradition about not being straight up, right? Am I with you?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
So was there a moment reading the text when suddenly they start to say that they are sitting up straight? And if there is a moment like that, then what could be the reason?
In one of the early Jain texts, in Chaos Saga, the standing posture, which I didn't go into, the body is described as being like a plank. So that could be in terms of it being upright, or it could be in terms of its being stillness and completely inanimate. And that's an early Jain text, the name of which escapes me right now, but if I can go back and send it to you if you want to mail me afterwards. In the Jaina text, uprightness really becomes a thing. It's sort of 11th to 12th century in the Hemachandra Yoga Shastra. There's a whole typology of uprightness of the mind, uprightness of the body. So it's really kind of taken root there. I didn't find it before that, but again, I can't say that I was completely comprehensive. I think in the Brahminical texts, it could be argued that they are saying that you're sitting upright from very early on, because there's this idea of sama with the head, the neck, and the body in that three-part scheme. But there seems to be a distinction between how they describe it and how the Buddhists describe it. So, but I'd say the Jainas definitely, there seems to be a movement later towards the medieval period towards straightness or uprightness really becoming something present in the texts.
And can you maybe think of a reason why?
I mean,
what could be the historical moment that inspires?
It's a great question. I'm not sure, but possibly maybe that just meditative practice is becoming something more of a common practice among all these groups, and it was something that was just known among different groups, possibly more. But I don't have the answer to that. But thank you.
Yeah, it certainly does seem to be quite significant, doesn't it? Because I had a look through my text database, and yeah, you're right. Later on in the Brahmanical traditions, they always says straight body, but early no.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting observation. Okay, there's an anonymous one for Scott. Are you saying that the change in terminology, which change in terminology denotes different types of consciousness?
I think, I mean, if you want to, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I would actually think of it the other way around, meaning often the same terminology is describing different meanings. And this, like, where the early Buddhists they'll say samadhi, but 300 years later, the Abhidhamma Buddhists will say samadhi and they'll mean something entirely different. And, 300 years later, Patanjali will write samadhi and he'll mean something entirely different. And then 500 years later, Tantra or Hatha Yoga, they'll use the word samadhi and they'll mean something entirely different. So, the terminology oddly stays very, very solid, while the meaning around it seems to fluctuate quite a bit.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, we've got one from Ruth, but I think she's unable to read this. From Ruth Westerby for Ruth, so I shall read it out. Fascinating research topic, Ruth. Are there any connections between straightness and moving energy upwards?
Again, I think there are some cursory mentions to this in the Upaniṣads. I don't believe in the Pali Nikāyas. I don't believe in the Jaina early texts that I looked at. And again, from my really scant knowledge, I think this comes in from, you know, the tantric period, but this becomes a thing. And I really wanted to look more at that because it seemed to kind of just open up the idea of the Shushumna Nadi and the whole aspect from that point onwards. But it just wasn't within my field of research for this particular topic. But I think that would be like a really interesting thing to see how this early stuff influences, or if it does influence the next part, because there obviously is some correlation there in those developments, but what they are is unclear to me as yet.
Okay, thanks. Now we've got one for Scott from Rich. I'll read it out. What are the differences between these three samadhi states, nirvikalpa of Hindus, kaivalya of Jains, the union of shamatha and vipassana for Buddhists? Easy question, obviously.
Yeah, that's a small topic. Well, I think that first of all of these are later conceptions. Like the difference between samatha and vipassana is an abhidhamma conception. So it doesn't, I haven't done sufficient research on this, but there's a lot of scholarship about the relationship between samatha and vipassana. Kaivalya, in Jainism, I think that Ruth or Erica might be better suited. I actually don't know when the idea of Kaivalya enters into the canon, because like the idea of samadhi is not present in the Acharanga or the Uttara to the best of my knowledge, which are the earliest Jaina texts. I don't even think it's in the what is it, the Tattvarta Sutta? Yeah, Dhyana enters the canon there, but I don't think samadhi is in that one either. And even that is a classical era text. And the same is kind of true of nirvikalpa, which is potentially the first place that appears. And that seems perhaps to be related to, this is a speculation, like the Abhidharma separation of samadhi into two paths, which is the path of access concentration and absorption concentration, where you kind of have two levels of samadhi that appear. And that seems perhaps to carry into Patanjali, where you have savikalpa and nirvikalpa. And like actually, Karen O'Brien-Kopp has done like brand new research on this that I'm eager to read about the relationship between the Abhidharma and Patanjali. But I know that's not a satisfying answer, but.
Okay, well, thanks. Karen did pop up at one point, so she might have heard your request there, if we're lucky. I'm not sure if she's still there. Right, well, we've got just two more questions. If everyone's happy to stay for a few more minutes, we should be able to get them out as well. So there's an anonymous one for Erica. I was wondering how early Jains came to the concept of nigoda. Did it help to numerically account for all the jivas that have existed?
That's an interesting question. My research didn't go into why this measured approach came to be in Jainism. Nigodas are said to be the source of souls. So there are a finite number of souls in bondage. And so when someone is liberated from that space, then, you know, there has to be sort of a replacement. And it's said that that is pulled from the nigodas. There are other ways of seeing the nigodas. So it bears further research to see why that developed, why this demarcation and very measured numerical approach developed, and the ways that the nigodas were then treated and understood as time developed, as time went on. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's a good point about the finite number. So they can't help with the maths if there's always a fixed number anyway. Okay, and then final question for Scott, which is from Alexander. It's quite a technical one. I'm going to hand over to Alexander for this one, if he's there to ask it, please.
Hi, James. Hi, Scott. Scott, thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. Very interesting point, the difference about some sources. My question, hopefully very brief, very quick one. So this verse in Upanishad's, if you mentioned, it was the attention of many different scholars. And for example, Johannes Bronkhorst renders it a little bit differently from Oliver, Patrick Oliver. And the meaning slightly changes. Yeah, so it is not so obvious that Samahito is following knowledge. Yeah. And my question is, that's why my question is, so is it, what do you think actually? What do you think? Is it worth to go a little bit deeper into these early Brahmanical, maybe Vedic sources, just to understand what all these terms really mean in that context? How it was done for many different terms like tapas and so forth. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm not sure what fruit it would bear if we dug really into like, what does Samahito mean in that exact context, and then how does that play out over history? I mean, it seems like Jim said a little while ago that especially in these early Brahmanical texts, the adjectives are somewhat general, and you know, that passage in the Brihadaranyaka it lists what 4 or 5 different adjectives, and I'd be very interested to do the deep dive, but I'm not sure that it would fundamentally change our understanding of what the Brahmins thought about Samahito at that moment, or how it changed, you know, 1,000 years later, or yeah, like how it evolved into Samadhi. Yeah. What do you think? What does Bronkhorst? I saw the question and I tried to find my Bronkhorst, but how does Bronkhorst translate it?
Just a moment. So Bronkhorst renders it like, therefore, knowing this, having become calm, subdued, quiet, patiently enduring, concentrated, one sees the soul in oneself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It looks like it is parallel actions.
Sure, like it happens at the same time as opposed to causally. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure that it fundamentally changes the way that we understand, you know, the way that the Brahmins, like, it doesn't add clarity, right? It kind of like subtracts clarity from the way they were using it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Scott. Thank you very much to all the participants, to Ruth, Erica, Scott, Corinna. That was great. It's a shame we have to all just click, you know, end meeting now and can't wander off and go and chat over a coffee or a beer or whatever and go out to dinner. But hopefully soon we'll be able to meet in person.